It can do, absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that this is sort of some set of, bogus math foisted upon the world. It can be incredibly useful and incredibly illuminating. I wouldn't waste my time in large chunks of my life thinking about it and writing about it if I didn't think that was the case. But, there's the way that we think about it can also have deleterious effects. So let's go back to the OECD 1984 jobs report, which made the case for flexibility in labor markets. When you read that now, it's a very interesting document because at a time when we're concerned with the fragility of labor markets, the costs that have been thrown onto workers, the lack of compensation mechanisms and insurance mechanisms, we talk about precarity, all these sorts of things. None of that is imaginable in that world. We're basically allowing markets to be more liquid, allowing labor markets to be more flexible. But there's no people in that report. There's no question as to what will these policy reforms do to single mothers trying to get to work, right? And I think what's happened, and partly this is the past 15 years of the turn towards kind of empirical micro, and the way that sort of macroeconomics has reconfigured itself after the Great Recession, and also a generational shift in what economics is interested in and economists are interested in general. I don't think that report could be written now. I think that what we're writing now is when Piketty first started doing his work, the kind of the mainstream old guard was like, oh, we don't do this. That's nonsense. You don't have to think about distribution. I can't imagine an economist actually coming out now and saying, you don't have to think about distribution, right? So I think that there's been a shift in orientation. And that then leads us into, well, where should economics be applied? And if one thing is clear, it's in the economics of the climate crisis. But there's been a great deal of consternation on Twitter and elsewhere about whether the economics we're using is actually adequate. I remember I was at an OECD meeting and someone pointed out that if you basically run the models backwards on the estimates of economic losses from climate change using the standard models, then essentially if you go back to the ice age when New York City was under several 100 meters of ice, you should only be losing 4% of GDP.
Yeah.
Right, so clearly that's wrong, and that type of thinking can do harm. But if we're aware of those limitations, if we're sensitive of those limitations, then it can be applied in ways that are incredibly helpful to society going forward. We have to do a green transition. Every country has to do it. We have to do it as a planet. The costs of this are huge, but what's even more important is how you get there. And that's going to require enormous amounts of, if I may, bribery to the most vulnerable and most affected groups to basically wean them off of carbon. How do you do that? Well, partly it's politics, but partly it's economics, and partly it's thinking about how do we do this in the best, most equitable way. That's a question of justice, but it's also a question of efficiency in economics.
Yeah, the environment work you referred to was by Steve Keen.
That's right. It was, Steve. You're right. Absolutely, it was. It was a great presentation. Very, very disturbing.
Yeah, and criticizing William Nordhaus, the
yes,
Nobel Prize-winning economist. But I did want to ask one follow-up. You mentioned the 1984 report and how things have changed, but structural reforms are still essentially the centerpiece of economic policy, and the advice is still about flexibility and competition. What's your assessment on that today? Do you think it's changed to reflect these realities and how the discipline has changed? Or is there still a sense that if we get the structural policy settings right, the market will self-organize? And so therefore, it hasn't changed that much in terms of what the fundamental advice is.
I think that you're still right, but it will become less right over time. I think that there's a shift away from the kind of standard sort of three equation new Keynesian model where the supply side determines everything. I think that people are once again thinking about demand as its own thing and the importance of demand, and rethinking a lot of the fundamental architecture to do with trade-offs between unemployment, inflation, etc., that are built into those supply side models, which lead you then to say structural reform is what you need to do. Now, the thing about it is, it's not as if structural reform is meaningless, right? I mean, Italy hasn't grown in 20 years. Is it all because of structural reform? No. If you look at the structural reform indices, during the 1990s and in the early 2000s, Italy was one of the best performers. So clearly that's not the only thing holding them back, being in possibly the wrong currency and then having a very old society that doesn't generate a lot of domestic demand when that's what the growth model demands. That's probably it. And I think that there's a beginning to be a realization of this. I saw something very interesting the other week, and it was a research publication from one of the hedge funds, and they're a good bellwether for like how people in the mainstream think about economics. Call them the economic users, the customers in a sense. And it was a very interesting piece, because what they said was, if we all accept now, interesting, he said this, there's no such thing as a good recession, right? It's not therapeutic. It doesn't clean out the system. You never get back to where you were before. And the IMF basically crunched the numbers on all the recessions they could find, and they basically proved this. But what they also showed was that countries that did have good structural reforms, right, the ones that had more flexibility, better buffers, etc., and it depends on what you mean by structural reform, right? In many ways, Denmark is a wonderful example of structural reform, but that's not what's usually in the folk model of structural reform. But nonetheless, the countries that have actually got, good structural policies tend to do better coming out of recessions. I totally accept that. I think that that's probably true, right? If you have a crappy, sclerotic, cartelized labor market that's resistant to change, and you have a recession, it'll probably be harder to get out than one that allocates labor a bit more efficiently. I've got no problem with that. Is that the answer to everything? Is that what we do in policy? I think that's part of the problem that we've been facing up to for the past decade or so. And I think that the wheels are beginning to turn on that.
Yeah, it's also very related to this issue, which is everybody talks about right now, which is resilience. And it's very clear that if you talk to economists who believe very much in structural, they'll argue that basically the more flexible things are, the more you'll be able to absorb a shock. So more structural reform means more resilience. Whereas if you come at it from more an engineering, natural science point of view, then the more efficient you try to make these markets, the problem you create for resilience. So there's very different perspectives. It's really hard to reconcile them as we move forward. And there's still a lot of talk, by the way, on the cleansing effect of recessions, and that the zombie firms will go out of business. And, this is a good thing. But
yeah. On that one, though, I think this is slightly different. The real example of the cleansing recession one is the expansionary fiscal contraction. Right. And I just do not see that one coming back anytime soon after the disaster that was the European and British experiments with this. So that one's gone. Now, as to the latter one, are we basically holding up sectors which are never going to come back? Maybe. Is it actually the case that the American solution of giving expanded unemployment benefits may actually be better in the long run for getting out of a recession than putting everything in mothballs for a year and a half? Maybe. I'm even willing to go probably on this. Like I say, it's not as if, structure doesn't matter. It deeply matters. But I think we have to recognize that it's not the thing that matters. And I think that's where the essence, where the weighting is changing, shall we say.